Georgia is about to become the single most expensive Senate race in the entire country, and the numbers backing that claim aren't speculation. They're already on file with the Federal Election Commission. One candidate has raised more money than any other Senate candidate in America this cycle. The other just survived a bruising Republican runoff that exposed real cracks inside his own party before the general election even began. Tonight we're going deep inside this race. The primary fight that got Mike Collins here, the ethics investigation trailing him into the general, the fundraising gaps that's genuinely staggering once you see the real numbers, and the reason Georgia's own non-partisan election forecasters just moved this race in Jon Ossoff's direction. Stick with me for the next 30 minutes because this is the fullest picture you're going to find anywhere of exactly where this race actually stands. Let's start with why this race carries so much weight in the first place. Jon Ossoff is the only Democratic senator up for re-election anywhere in the country in a state Donald Trump actually won. That single fact is why national Republicans circled this race years in advance as one of the clearest paths to expanding their majority. And it is why Democrats have treated defending this seat as one of the absolute top priorities heading into November. Ossoff himself won this exact seat back in January 2021 runoff by a margin thin enough that both parties still remember exactly how close it was. And he spent his entire first term as one of the most heavily targeted Democrats in the Senate. Before we get to Collins, understand the primary battle that actually produced him as the nominee, because it tells you a lot about the state of the Republican Party in Georgia right now. 5 Republicans entered the race to take on Ossoff, but it quickly narrowed down to 3 real contenders: Congressman Mike Collins, Congressman Buddy Carter, and Derek Dooley, a former University of Tennessee football coach and attorney making his first run for any political office. When none of them cleared 50% in May primary, the race went to a runoff between top 2 finishers, Collins and Dooley. That runoff turned into a genuine proxy war inside Georgia's Republican establishment. Governor Brian Kemp threw his full weight behind Dooley, campaigning aggressively on his behalf and making the explicit argument the Republicans needed a political outsider, someone with a lengthy voting record or congressional baggage, to actually beat Ossoff in November. Donald Trump saw it differently. In just 2 days before the runoff, after early voting had already concluded, he endorsed Collins, a genuinely risky last-minute move that put his own political capital directly on line in a fight against the sitting governor of a state he needs to win. Trump's bet paid off decisively. Collins won the runoff with roughly 56% of the vote, a comfortable double-digit margin that Republican strategists read as a real sign where the GOP primary voters' loyalties actually sit right now, even against the sitting governor's direct opposition. In his victory speech, Collins thanked Dooley for running what he called a spirited campaign and thanked Kemp for his years of leadership and friendship. A gracious note that couldn't fully paper over just how sharp the underlying party split had actually been. Now there's a detail worth sitting with here because it says something real about the current relationship between Trump and elected Republicans, even in deep red territory. Governor Brian Kemp is term limited and immensely popular in Georgia, arguably the most successful Republican politician in a state over the past decade, and Trump's endorsements still beat him decisively in his own backyard. That's not a small signal. It's a reminder that inside today's Republican Party, presidential loyalties tend to outweigh gubernatorial popularity, even when the two are pulling primary voters in opposite directions. It's worth noting that it wasn't the only high-profile Georgia primary where Trump and Kemp's preferences diverged this cycle. Georgia's Republicans were simultaneously navigating a costly, contentious primary for governor, with the Trump-aligned candidate ultimately losing to the nominee backed by the state's existing Republican establishment. A split result that suggests Trump-Kemp tension is a one-off dynamic confined to the Senate race, but a generally fault line running through Georgia's Republican politics this entire cycle. Collins winning his own primary decisively, even as a different establishment-aligned candidate prevailed in the governor's race, paints a picture of a party that's still actively sorting out exactly where endorsement carries the most weight. Now turn to who Mike Collins actually is, because his background matters enormously to how this general election is shaping up. He was first elected to the House in 2022, running a trucking company before entering politics, and he's built his entire brand around being an unapologetic, combative Trump ally. At a rally the night before the runoff, he described himself as a conservative workhorse and made his opening case against Ossoff directly, arguing the senator doesn't reflect Georgia's values, dismissing his career and framing him as bought and paid out by out-of-state donors on the coasts. Now, Ossoff wasted no time returning the fire, and his response reveals exactly the line of attack Democrats plan to run for the rest of his race. He pointed directly at Collins' family's political history, noting that Collins' own father, Mike Collins, previously served as Congress representing Georgia, framing Mike Collins as someone whose entire political career traces back to that inherited name recognition rather than anything he built independently. It's a sharp personal line, and it's clearly designed to undercut the outsider, workhorse image Collins is trying to project. This is exactly where this race gets considerably more serious than typical campaign trail snipping. Collins is currently facing an active House Ethics Committee investigation. The probe centers on allegations that he misused congressional funds, specifically by paying a former aide, his one-time Chief of Staff Brandon Phillips, for campaign work using congressional office resources, and by employing Phillips's girlfriend in a role investigators allege involved little to no actual work. Phillips was ultimately let go from both the campaign and the congressional office after publishing a disparaging post on Collins' own campaign social media account, an incident that only added more scrutiny to an already uncomfortable situation. Now, it is important to understand why this specific allegation lands differently than a typical political attack line, because the mechanism matters. House Ethics Committee investigation aren't opposition research dressed up as a scary label. They're formal institutional inquiries conducted by a bipartisan committee with actual subpoena power, and they can result in real findings, recommendations, and consequences regardless of which party controls the chamber at the time. That formal weight is exactly why Ossoff's campaign has been so eager to keep this story in front of voters, because it isn't simply his word against Collins. It's an active, ongoing institutional process that could produce a concrete finding well before November. Collins, however, has firmly denied any wrongdoings, calling the allegation bogus and telling supporters directly that he can win this race regardless of whatever attacks get thrown at him. But the ethics probe hasn't gone away, and it gives Ossoff's campaign a genuinely potent, non-abstract line of attack heading into the fall. The kind of concrete allegation that's considerably harder to wave off than a generic ideological disagreement. Ossoff has already previewed exactly how central this issue will be to his general election message, describing Collins in blunt terms as a congressman currently under federal investigation for allegedly misusing tax dollars. Now, that's not the only line of attack Ossoff's planned to run, though. When Collins' runoff win was called, Ossoff released a statement immediately going after him on policy grounds as well, arguing Collins has voted to double health insurance premiums for more than 1 million Georgians and criticizing his votes in support of the administration's approach to Iran conflict and its tariff policy. Each of those three issues, healthcare costs, an unpopular foreign conflict, and tariffs squeezing household budgets, map directly onto the kind of kitchen table anxieties that have been shaping this entire midterm cycle nationally, not just in Georgia specifically. Now, we need to understand why Ossoff is leaning into all three of these issues simultaneously rather than picking just one. Healthcare costs give him a concrete personal number to put in front of voters rather than an abstract ideological argument. The Iran conflict lets him tie Collins directly to a foreign policy outcome that's generated real public anxiety over the past several weeks. And tariffs let him connect national economic policy to something Georgia's voters are already feeling directly in their household budgets, from grocery bills to gas prices. Running all these three together is a deliberate strategy to make sure no single voter's specific frustration gets left out of the campaign's core message. Collins, for his part, hasn't shied away from these warts, and understanding this actual defense matters just as much as understanding the attack. His campaign has consistently framed his voting record as standing firmly behind the administration's broader agenda, arguing that short-term economic friction from tariffs and other policies is a worthwhile trade-off from what he describes as a strong long-term negotiating position for American workers and industries. Whether Georgia voters, particularly suburban voters, actually feel squeezed by the cost of living pressure, find that argument persuasive by November, is exactly the kind of question polling this far simply can't answer with confidence. Now, let's turn to money, because this is genuinely one of the most lopsided fundraising gaps in any competitive Senate race in the entire country, and the actual numbers are more dramatic than most people following this race casually would guess. According to the Federal Election Commission findings, Ossoff has raised more than $80 million for his race as his most recent report, with $32 million still sitting in his campaign account ready to spend. Collins, by comparison, has raised just under $5 million, total by the time his post-runoff filing came due. with roughly $1.2 million in cash on hand. Trace how that gap actually built over time, because it didn't happen in a single quarter. Back at the beginning of the primary season, when 5 Republicans were still competing for the nomination, Collins was actually the top GOP fundraiser in the entire field, and even his leading position among Republicans looked modest next to Ossoff's numbers, which were already running many multiples ahead of every single Republican combined. Buddy Carter, Collins' closest rival for the nomination, through much of the spring had raised only a fraction of Ossoff's total by the same point, and Derek Dooley's fundraising leaning almost entirely on large dollar contribution rather than the kind of broad grassroots support Ossoff has already built. Sit with the gap for a second, because it's not a modest financial edge. It's closer to 25-1 advantage in available cash heading into fall. Ossoff didn't build that war chest overnight either. He raised more than $14 million in the first quarter of 2026 alone, on top of $43 million raised across all of 2025, giving him by a wide margin the largest fundraising total of any Senate candidate anywhere in the country this entire cycle. Now, there's a texture of how that money actually comes in, that's worth understanding too, because it reveals something after the coalition each side is actually building. More than half of Ossoff's total contribution, roughly 53%, came from small dollar donors, giving $200 or less, the kind of broad grassroots donor base that suggests real, wide-scale enthusiasm rather than reliance on small numbers of wealthy backers. Collins' fundraising mix looked considerably different heading into the runoff, built from a combination of large contribution, smaller grassroots money, and transfers from other campaign committees, including his own joint fundraising operation. Another factor that could reshape the financial picture is the role of outside spending, which often rivals or even exceeds what campaigns spend themselves in the most competitive Senate races. Organizations such as party committees, super PACs, and non-profit advocacy groups are not bound by the same fundraising limits as candidates, allowing them to pour tens of millions of dollars into advertising, voter outreach, and digital campaigns. Georgia has repeatedly been one of the country's most expensive political battlegrounds, with outside groups spending hundreds of millions of dollars during recent election cycles. That means Collins' current fundraising disadvantage, while significant, doesn't necessarily tell the entire story of the resources Republicans could eventually have at their disposal. If national GOP strategists conclude that defeating Ossoff is essential to protecting or expanding their Senate majority, they have multiple avenues to invest heavily in Georgia during the campaign's final months. Democrats are expected to do exactly the same to defend one of the highest-profile incumbents. In other words, while campaign fundraising offers an important snapshot of where the race stands today, the total amount of money voters ultimately see spent on television ads, mailers, and digital outreach will almost certainly be far larger than either candidate's own campaign account alone would suggest. Now, it's worth being fair to the other side of this argument too, because raw fundraising totals don't automatically decide elections, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Political scientists who study campaign finance have pointed out directly that money functions more like a price of admission than a guarantee of victory, noting that other factors, endorsements, candidate quality, the national political environment, often matter just as much or maybe more once both sides have enough resources to actually get their message out. Trump's endorsement alone evidently mattered more than Kemp's institutional backing in the Republican primary, proof that money isn't the only lever capable of moving a race. Still, a gap this large carries real practical consequences heading into an expensive general election. Every dollar Ossoff has sitting in the bank is a dollar that can be spent on advertising, field organizing, and voter turnout operations the moment the general election truly kicks in gear. While Collins is going to need a genuinely historic fundraising surge over the next couple of months just to compete on the airwaves at anything resembling parity. National Republican outside groups will almost certainly step in to help close that gap, but that's a different, less controllable dynamic than a campaign having its own resources readily available to deploy on its own timeline. Now let's turn to how non-partisan election forecasters are actually reading this race, because the professional assessment has been moving in one direction. The Cook Political Report, one of those most respected non-partisan election forecasters in the country, initially rated this contest as a toss-up. In mid-June, right around the time Collins secured this nomination, Cook shifted its rating to lean Democratic, a real, meaningful move that reflects genuine analytical judgment about where this race is actually trending, not just a single poll or partisan talking point. Cook's own written analysis of this race is worth understanding directly because it lays out the challenge facing Collins with real specificity. Their assessment described Collins as carrying a combative, controversial social media presence, a hardline position on abortion, and that trending ethical investigation concluding he isn't naturally suited to appeal to the suburban Atlanta voters this race will likely hinge on. Cook's analysis puts the burden squarely on Collins to prove that he can run a disciplined campaign and become a genuinely competitive fundraiser against a financially dominant incumbent, rather than assuming either of those things will simply happen on their own. Layer polling data on top of that shifting professional consensus, and the picture only reinforces itself further. Multiple surveys conducted across the spring and early summer have shown Ossoff with a consistent lead over his various potential Republican opponents, including one Emerson College polling survey that found him ahead of every possible GOP matchup, albeit with a real chunk of voters still undecided this far out from November. Separate polling from Echelon Insights, a poll survey at Clive Roaster typically skews Republican, found Ossoff ahead of Collins specifically by 7 points. A result that carries extra weight precisely because it isn't coming from a pollster with an incentive to make Democrats look stronger than they actually are. But there's a wrinkle that arrived in the middle of this exact race and adds a genuinely significant new layer to the entire national picture. The Supreme Court's ruling at the end of June striking down federal limits on coordinated spending between political parties and their own candidates. Georgia's own political reporters flagged this ruling explicitly as a development with direct consequences from this exact Senate battle, since it means that national party committees on both sides can now legally pour dramatically more money directly into whichever candidate they're backing, without the coordinated spending caps that used to apply. For a race already shaping up to be the most expensive in the country, that ruling adds real fuel directly onto an already blazing fire. Think through what that actually means in practice for the specific candidate in this race. Under the old rules, national Democratic and Republican Senate campaign committees could only coordinate a limited capped amount spending directly with Ossoff's and Collins' own campaign. That cap is now gone. If Republican strategists conclude that closing Collins' financial gap with Ossoff is worth a serious national investment, this ruling gives them a legal pathway to pour in dramatically more money than would have been possible even a few weeks ago, potentially narrowing a financial disadvantage that otherwise looked close to insurmountable heading into the fall. That's also a symbolic moment worth understanding from Ossoff's side of this campaign because it signals exactly how he's trying to build his coalition heading into the fall. In late June, Ossoff held a joint campaign rally in Savannah alongside former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, branded under the banner United for Georgia, an event clearly designed to project party unity and consolidate Democrat enthusiasm early, rather than waiting until the final weeks of the campaign to start building that coalition. It's also worth being genuinely fair to the case for Republicans' optimism here because a fundraising gap and a shifted forecaster rating aren't the same thing as settled outcome. And treating this race as already decided would be exactly the kind of overconfidence that's burnt political prediction before. Georgia decided slots several major statewide races by margins under 3 points, and Trump himself carried this exact state in 2024 presidential election. This is fundamentally swing territory with a demonstrated capacity to break sharply in either direction within a single election cycle, and no amount of fundraising advantage completely insulates a campaign from a shifting national environment between now and November. Consider the specific scenarios that could realistically close this gap because they're not purely hypothetical. If the national political environment shifts meaningfully in Republicans' favors between now and the fall, whether driven by economic conditions, foreign policy developments, or simply a natural midterm correction, Collins wouldn't need to fully match Ossoff's spending dollar for dollar. He'd simply need his message to travel further on a smaller budget than it otherwise would. Now, Collins is also betting heavily on Trump's continued active involvement, and a president willing to campaign personally in Georgia in the campaign's final stretch could meaningfully offset at least part of the financial gap through sheer earned media attention alone, the kind of free, unpaid coverage no financial war chest can fully anticipate. Collins' own team is fully aware of the challenge in front of them and hasn't shied away from acknowledging it directly. Asked whether he plans to adjust his message heading into the general election, Collins has said plainly that he intends to say exactly who he is, rather than moderate his approach to chase suburban swing voters, a calculated bet that has his combative, unapologetically Trump-aligned brand is a strength worth leaning into rather than softening. Whether that bet pays off against a financially dominant opponent is exactly the suburban terrain Cook's own analysis flagged as his biggest vulnerability is precisely the question this entire general election is going to answer. Now zoom out one more time and place this single race inside the broader fight for control of the entire Senate, because Georgia's outcome carries weight far beyond its own borders. Republicans currently hold the Senate, and the Democrats need a net gain of 4 seats to split the cycle. Ossoff's seat was originally penciled by the strategists on both sides as one of Democrats' most vulnerable defenses precisely because it sits in a state Trump carried, the kind of seat National Republicans hoped would help offset losses elsewhere on the map. If Ossoff holds this seat as comfortably as the current numbers suggest, that removes one of Republicans' clearest pickup opportunities entirely, freeing National Democrat resources to focus on the genuine toss-up states, places like Ohio, Alaska, and Texas, and where the actual majority is far more likely to be decided. A single seat quietly shifting from vulnerable defense to comfortable hold can reshape where both parties choose to spend their final months of national advertising and organizing money. Consider what each side is actually betting on heading into the fall, because it clarifies exactly what to watch for over the coming months. Ossoff is betting that his massive financial advantage, his sharp, viral communication style, and Collins's ethics baggage combine to override Georgia's fundamentally competitive baseline. Collins is betting that Trump's continued popularity with the Republican base, a potentially soaring national mood under different circumstances, and his own unapologetic combative persona can close a financial gap that looks nearly insurmountable on paper today. Both bets are coherent, only one of them is going to actually work. Now zoom out for a moment and look at the actual demographic terrain this race is going to be fought over, because it explains exactly why Cook's analysis signaled out of suburban Atlanta as the decisive battleground. Georgia's electoral map has been reshaped over the past decade by explosive growth in exactly those suburban communities, bringing Atlanta communities that have trended away from reflexive Republican support and towards a genuinely persuadable, well-educated electorate that both parties now have to actively compete for rather than assume. And it's exactly the demographic Ossoff's campaign has spent years cultivating a relationship with. There's also a useful historical parallel worth drawing here, because Georgia has been down something like this road before. Ossoff won his current seat in the same January 2021 runoff cycle that also sent Raphael Warnock to the Senate. A pair of Democratic victories in a state that had voted Republican in every single presidential election since 1996 up until the exact moment. Those wins aren't a fluke born out of unusually favorable circumstances that can never repeat. They were the product of exactly the kind of sustained suburban coalition building and massive fundraising advantage Ossoff is once again leaning on the cycle. Whether that same formula holds a second time against a different kind of opponent in a different political environment is a genuinely open question, but it's not an unprecedented one for Georgia's Democrats to be asking. Now, there's another reason strategists from both parties remain cautious despite the current polling, and it has everything to do with Georgia's turnout history. Over the past several election cycles, the state has developed a reputation for producing exceptionally high voter participation in closely watched races. In 2020 presidential elections saw record turnout, followed just 2 months later by 2 Senate runoff elections that again shattered previous participation records for a January election. Since then, both parties have continued investing heavily in voter registration, early voting operations, and absentee ballot outreach, transforming Georgia into one of the country's most intensely organized political battlegrounds. That means that the eventual outcome may depend less on persuading large number of undecided voters than on which campaign is most successful at motivating its existing supporters to actually cast a ballot. Political scientists often point that in modern Georgia elections, turnout operations can be just as influential as television advertising or debate performances, with margins in recent statewide races frequently measured in only tens of thousands of votes out of million casts. Even small differences in participation among suburban voters, rural conservatives, or black voters in Metro Atlanta could ultimately determine who wins the Senate seat. So what should you be actually watching for as this race develops over the next couple of months? Watch whether outside spending freshly unleashed by the Supreme Court's recent ruling starts flowing heavily into Georgia from national party committees on both sides. and watch the broader national environment, because a race this closely tied to Georgia's competitive baseline is ultimately going to move with whatever happens nationally between now and Election Day, regardless of how comfortable either candidate's current position looks in July. The honest bottom line sitting underneath everything we just covered is this. Right now, on paper, in the money, in the professional ratings, and in the polling, this looks like genuinely strong position for Jon Ossoff heading into a race that was originally supposed to be one of Democrats' most difficult defenses of the entire race. But Georgia's own recent history is the single best reason not to treat any of this as settled. A state that keeps deciding its biggest races by the narrowest possible margin, cycle after cycle, no matter how comfortable either side's summer polling looks. If this dive helps you actually understand everything driving this race, the primary fight, the ethics probe, the historical fundraising gap, and the professional ratings shift, share it with someone who's been asking whether Georgia is really still in play this cycle. Drop a comment with your own prediction of how this one plays out in November, because I want to see where this audience lands. Drop a comment with your own prediction for how this one plays out in November, because I want to see where this audience lands before the actual votes get counted. Subscribe for updates as new fundraising reports and pollings come in over the next several months, because a race this expensive, this personal, and this consequential for a control of Senate is not going to stay quiet between now and Election Day. I'll see you in the next one.